All right, welcome everybody. My name is Sharon Klein. I'm an associate professor in the School of Economics, and I'm here to introduce our speaker today. Stephenie MacLagan is the Senior Community Development Officer for Sustainable Community Infrastructure at the Island Institute. She's a graduate of Unity College with a BS in Environmental Policy and a graduate of Maine with an MS in Resource Economics and Policy, advised by Dr. Kathleen Bell, there in the audience, from the School of Economics. She studied soft shell clam management with support from the Senator George J. Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions. So we have a Mitchell Center alum here who's speaking to us today. Stephenie has worked in both the private and nonprofit sectors, including more than 7 years at the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, where her work included waterfront and infrastructure projects. And in 2006, she was recognized as one of the 20 Women for Sustainable Development by the National Wildlife Federation. She has been at the Island Institute since May of 2015, where she combines environmental science, natural resource economics, and policy in working with island and coastal communities to strengthen diverse economies, future resiliency, and environmental connections. In her current role at the Island Institute, Stephenie is responsible for strategizing projects across the broadband, energy, and sea level rise teams to maximize contributions toward delivering on the strengthening community economy's strategic goal of the Island Institute.
But yes, thank you so much for welcoming me here, and I really hope to connect with you all individually, whether professionally or as a fellow alum in the future. So feel free to reach out. I do have my cards in the back of the room as well. I'm going to trust that you read the rest of the abstract beyond my bio, so I won't bore you with that. And really just want to share with you my excitement to be here because I think this is a good example. What I'm going to present to you is a good example of iterative stakeholder engagement process. It's an example anyway, and I really challenge us to think about what's good about it and what could be strengthened. And I think a part of my excitement is really for all of you, because the story that I'm going to tell you through this process is one actually born out of academia. If it wasn't for Suzanne McDonald's graduate project, she may never have gotten onto this track of community energy and developed an incredible program at the Island Institute that has gone on to serve all of our offshore islands in Maine and continues to make impacts on coastal communities in Maine and beyond, even across the pond in Europe. So Suzanne unfortunately could not be here today. She is wearing so many hats at the Island Institute these days, and part of her job is the culmination of this work, which we call the Community Development Policy. It's basically how we work. And so while she can't be here, I'm happy to be able to share her story around energy and how this is a good example of the way that we work in this iterative process. She began working with the community of Monhegan in the realm of energy, as I said, with her graduate work. By winter of '07, if anybody recalls driving back then, the fuel prices had completely skyrocketed, and as much as gasoline was hitting everybody's wallets, diesel was incredibly impactful to diesel-based electric co-ops on the islands, these islanded grids. And so they were in real trouble because part of the problem with their structure was that the revenue came in at a different time than they needed to expend to buy the diesel in order to have year-round electricity on these islands. So just as the summer businesses are starting to ramp up, they don't actually have the coffers to keep the lights on for all of these summer businesses. And so that was the crisis that Monhegan had found itself in. And I'll come back to this story throughout my presentation. But back up just a little bit. The Island Institute is a nonprofit community development-based organization, and we work to sustain coastal and island communities here in Maine, as well as exchange ideas and information to further the sustainability of communities here in Maine and beyond. We even have what we call island fellows. It's kind of an AmeriCorps position on many of the islands and coastal communities. We even have one based in Millinocket, for example. So we really pride ourselves on this idea of exchanging information and co-learning with people. My name is Stephenie, and I came to the Island Institute to work half on broadband high-speed internet infrastructure and half on shellfish and seaweed aquaculture, which was kind of born out of my graduate work. So it was a good combination of my years of experience working with municipalities to get them to implement mandates that weren't funded, and to also couple that with the shellfish and marine systems that I had been learning about here. I now oversee these 3 infrastructure teams of sustainable community infrastructure, which includes our energy, sea level rise, and broadband, which are mentioned. And the energy project team at the Island Institute in particular does a lot of intersecting work with our delivering and sharing solutions teams, which includes What Works. And so basically the idea is what we do with communities on energy issues, we learn from in a broader context, a more generalized context, and then we share that. We deliver those solutions for other communities to then learn from and consider in their own journeys. But the bottom line was, after graduating here, and even the reason that I matriculated in here was because I was able to work at that intersection of economy, ecology, and policy. And it was really, really a messy place to work. It was very, very difficult to do. And so when I left and was looking, where's my next career move going to be, I was looking for a place that understood that. It was not only important for me to continue working in that space, but to have it recognized why that space was important and how difficult it was. And the Island Institute was embarking on a transition of its own into that realm. And so it was a really good match, I think, at that time. And it's been very interesting ever since. So while we're getting messy, and this is the center was born out of this idea of it's messy, it's wicked, hard, and everything else. So if this outline sounds familiar to you, I think that's why, because this is, in a sense, my professional birthplace. And so when looking at what the Island Institute does and how we do it, I immediately saw a mirror to what you all do here at the center, and how you approach it. But it can be dangerous. This is not easy territory to navigate, but it can also be a ton of fun. So if I was going to take poetic license, so to speak, to describe how the work on Monhegan began, it would be something like a lobsterman, an artist, and an engineer walked into a bar. And I think that really exemplifies how this work comes to be. It's multidisciplinary. It's people of all walks of life, of all demographics, of all socioeconomic backgrounds, and they all have something to bring to bear that when put together, when that puzzle forms, it creates something that couldn't be created otherwise. So let's get into it. And I think a lot of this work is very serious, so it's fun to find those moments when we can be creative and laugh at ourselves, so to speak. So with communities like Monhegan, how we got started was basically conversation. And this was because Suzanne MacDonald had a personal relationship with so many of the islanders, but it's also the way that we approach communities today, is with open ears and open eyes. What is going on? What do we observe? How does that help us define what's going on? And then how can we engage in conversation with community members to learn more and to hear how they're defining their circumstances and their future? In the winter of 07 and 08, as those fuel prices were skyrocketing and the bank accounts couldn't keep up, on Monhegan they also had a crisis of their generators failing. It had just been that long since the generators were constructed, and now it was time to replace them. So there was a huge community meeting. The power district had to announce that they were going to be increasing rates in order to replace these generators and keep up with the summer demand for energy, and to hopefully stabilize their revenue and expenses throughout the year. So the rate was going to change from 55 cents per kilowatt hour to over 70 cents per kilowatt hour. It's just a dramatic change in the everyday lives of folks who were dependent on a single fisheries, lobster. Pretty precarious place to be in. This began the real identification of the problem for the community at large. It no longer was a district problem, it no longer was the summer business problem or even an individual lobsterman's household's problem. This was a community crisis. So the obstacles facing the community, how are they going to define their own need? How are they going to put the pieces together to try and figure out what was going to be their more stable, certain future? Monhegan knew that it was going to need community-wide support no matter what it decided for a project, no matter how it decided to move forward. That community-wide buy-in was going to be essential for the success of any project. So from the outset, the community leaders that had gathered to grapple with this problem needed to set a goal, or they wanted to set a goal. Like, if we know that this is what we're going to need, what does that look like? What does community buy-in look like? And it's really fascinating to me that when I go from community to community, it looks different in every community because of their makeup, because of their history. They define success in their own terms. And I think listening for what is success to you is really important, as well as what is the problem to you. And that way you can hope to be able to measure success at the end, measure whether the solution was in fact successful. For Monhegan, it was 75%. At town meeting. They wanted a vote of 75% of the year-round citizens to say, we want this project to move forward. And by setting that goal, I take the objective outsider perspective that they were able to get exactly 75%. Not more, not less. They set that horizon and they met it. And I have to wonder, if they hadn't set that horizon, would they have overshot it or would they have undershot it? Just an interesting outsider perspective. What's most fascinating to me, and what I take to other communities about this lesson, is that community-wide support that they got, it cut across all demographics. It cut across all political affiliations. And it cut across not only the year-round voters at that town meeting, but also the summer representation at that town meeting. So I think that speaks to having set a goal and knowing how you need to address that goal. For Monhegan, it was an incredible outreach effort by everybody involved in that committee, reaching out to their individual circles in the community to make sure that those various groups were all in support to that 75% level. Otherwise, how in the world were they able to get 75% regardless of demographics? It wasn't just them preaching to the choir. They actually went outside the choir to get that support. These economic and environmental and social challenges are kind of like parameters. And certain people feel comfortable with parameters and being put in boxes, and that makes it easy to move forward. And other people find it really difficult to be put into a box, and all of a sudden they feel like their thoughts or their creativity or their opportunities are stifled. And I think that the Monhegan story is an example of where that type of situation does come up, and there's the need for certain community members to bridge those gaps and navigate those dynamics on a more personal, professional, behavioral level, really, of how do you work around different personalities. These parameters, in the case of Monhegan, in that particular time and place, led them to a community energy plan that said land-based wind power is our most feasible project over solar, over continued, more efficient diesel. The ruralness affects economic feasibility. The more rural you are, the more expensive things often are to get built and to get there. Remoteness also increases that cost of implementation, the fewer human resources you have in that space. Coupled on Monhegan with a do-it-yourself culture. And I think that that's something that we experience often when working down east as well as on the islands, but I think it also pops up in rural western Maine as well. We've always pulled up our own selves from the bootstraps. We haven't been able to reliably rely on the state or federal government to fix our problems. Like, we've had to do it ourselves. And so recognizing that do-it-yourself culture really played into how the Island Institute and other partners were able to navigate the community dynamics and come up with solutions that worked for the community's own culture and history of doing it themselves. These three factors of ruralness, economics, remoteness, and cost, and do-it-yourself culture is what also led to the Fox Islands deciding that they would be doing a land-based wind project around the same time. But on Monhegan, we didn't actually see that play out. And so the question for the researcher, the observer, is to step back and ask why. And what we identified was a major shift or vacuum in local leadership at that moment. And so here's another hard lesson of how to do it and why it's messy, is you really do need those local leaders, those local champions who will drive a project forward, communicate it for their entire community, make sure everybody is still in belief of the end goal. And without that leadership, the project lagged on Monhegan to a point where the context, the parameters that were in play changed. And so when they revisited the community energy plan, no longer was land-based wind going to be their answer. The cost in solar had come down, and so that became a viable option to revisit and to look at. Through the many community interactions that we had, this iterative process of communication back and forth, we had an immense amount of new learning. And I think part of that was that Island Institute previously hadn't been all that cohesively engaged in energy issues. So we had a lot to learn. Our learning curve was steep. On Monhegan in particular, the housing stock in Maine is older than the nation. The housing stock on the coast is older than in Maine. And the housing stock on the islands is the oldest of them all. Several hundred years ago, over 300 islands had year-round communities, 300 plus schools, 300 plus postal offices. We're down to 15. So what is left, those housing stocks are definitely in dire need of repair and maintenance, and they're just really inefficient. They're huge energy sinks, both electricity and for heating. So recognizing that, and recognizing also that Monhegan's community leadership, these were artists, they were lobstermen, they were engineers by the means of taking a wrench to an old generator and making it go. They wanted a small project that they could show success on. And build on that small success. And I think that was a good strategy to take when you're trying to build community-wide buy-in into something super new and super crazy, and no other island community has done a wind or solar project. Are you nuts? Start small. And as an economist, start small, fail small. I'm just saying. So that's what they did. They took their energy efficiency efforts as their small project. If we just do some window dressing projects, if we just do some home insulation projects, we could really make a difference immediately in the pocketbooks of our residents, show that we understand the cost burden of increasing the rate of the power district, at the same time as opening up the community-wide dialogue for energy. So that was kind of the strategy taken throughout the years. And this isn't a step one, step two process. Obviously, the conversation started first with the district sustainability. Then it morphed into a larger conversation about renewable power and the future certainty of their power district. And then finally came back to, let's just talk small potatoes here. Let's just talk about one-on-one residents here. Let's sort out those basic human needs first before we take on a larger sustainability project. In other communities, they've seen these patterns and they want to start with the weatherization, the energy efficiency work. And that's an okay approach as well. There's no right or wrong answer, I don't think, to getting there. If solar is the new and sexy cool thing that all of a sudden gets all of Mount Desert Island weatherized, great. Solar first and then weatherization, it'll work. But for Monhegan in particular, building a solar project to an old housing stock looks very different technically and economically than building a solar project to a housing stock that has been recently weatherized and shored up. And so for them, it was really important to do this efficiency first in lockstep with the planning process of implementing the solar renewable energy. During this implementation process, we saw a lot of new obstacles, discoveries all the way along the way, whether it was financial or technical. And some of the technical obstacles might surprise you. As simple as human behavior, that do-it-yourself culture of like, I don't need anyone's help. I don't need anybody to tell me that my energy costs are too high or how to fix that. To the financial hurdles of how are we going to get insulation out to this island that's 10 miles off the shore? Like, who's going to pay to barge that? How are we going to get all of that insulation pumped into these houses in a time period that's conducive and get that barge back off the island? So I think where I'm going with this is to be open to where the obstacles might come from and think creatively and think in a community-based way for how to solve those problems. With regard to the cultural issue, these workshops were done by the students with the community members. And so they weren't doing them in their own homes. They weren't making themselves vulnerable to their situation or their economic status. They were coming to the school to a community event. The students were the ones showing and teaching, and it just broke down those vulnerability barriers so that any lobsterman, anybody on the island could feel confident in, oh, I know how to do this window insert now. Great. And now I've even done one. So I get to take that home and learn by that. So I think thinking creatively with the tools and the people that you have is really important to overcome these obstacles. This knowledge and solutions pivoting, if you will, around these obstacles, I think was a product of the co-production of knowledge. We would not have been able to recognize those obstacles without the conversations with the power district employees to say, you know, why is your neighbor not doing this? Why is your neighbor not showing up? Why are we struggling to find a company who will barge out insulation? To really understand what are those barriers so that they can then be creatively, a solution can be co-identified. Basically, you got to co-identify the problem first, I think, because that helps inform what might work for a solution. So part of the implementation, this is probably my most boring slide, so I put a link in there, so if you want to write down the link, have at it. That's a lot more entertaining. But basically, part of this implementation includes the documentation of all of these discoveries. What were the obstacles that were discovered? How did you overcome them? What can be generalized or known or applied for other communities? So Island Institute does that as we implement. As we implement, we also document. As we implement, we also share those stories. And we create opportunities for community members to share their own stories with other community members and with other experts in the field. And I think that that convening power is also a place of co-production of knowledge that's been really instrumental in projects like Monhegan's. So the Bridging the Rural Efficiency Gap is the culmination of our energy efficiency programming over 10 years. And it is a body of work that shares solutions not just in Maine, but also Vermont and New Hampshire. So I do encourage you to look up that link if you have an interest in this field, in this realm. And also if you have interest in just seeing an example, a case study of what it means to work with rural communities and work in rural communities and what those common obstacles are, because the work really speaks to not just energy, in my opinion. It's also been published in energy efficiency, so that's another location you can look it up. This process, as I mentioned, does continue. I think the act of going into whatever stakeholder group and listening and evaluating what's been done and what is being done, and then responding to the obstacles that are coming up, responding to the behaviors that are seen, that happens at the start, it happens during, and it's got to happen at the end. So it's pretty ongoing. And And what we saw on Monhegan in particular, as we continued to observe new behaviors, is once the energy efficiency had happened and energy costs dropped, even with the rate increase, other residents were feeling like, what more could they do? How much more savings can I find? And in particular, seasonal residents that are only there for a few months out of the year are having a hard time paying a power district for year-round power and security of the grid. And so, in large part, that demographic, but I think this did cross all demographics, there was an increase in the interest and installation of individual residential solar. On the mainland, this has, some would argue, a negligible impact on the utilities here on the mainland. Unfortunately for Monhegan and other islanded grids, this can have a huge dramatic change to the economic stability of a power district, whether it's a co-op, a company, or a quasi-municipal. And in Monhegan, basically the community members did do some calculations to figure out exactly how many tenths of cents more per kilowatt hour the rates would have to go up for every solar project installed. And so there was an education campaign that unfortunately leveraged fear and fear-mongering, for lack of a better word, and it became a divide of us versus them, year-rounders versus the summer population or seasonal population. You observe these behaviors. The question then becomes, now what? Like, we were on this great track. The power district was implementing and incorporating renewable energy. We were addressing the rates increases. And now all of that stability, all that work towards stability seems to be eroding away. So now what? This instability of the district's finances, it wasn't new. I mean, obviously they had been dealing with unmatched revenue to expenses. Now they had an issue of eroding away revenue. Ultimately, the rate structure was such that most of the revenue came from usage. If you didn't use the energy, you didn't pay for it. The fee for the actual grid, maintaining the grid, and making sure that that grid could deliver the service was very nominal. And so they continue to try to suss out what is the right structure, and how can we learn from other microgrids to figure out what will work here, and what is the most equitable and fair structure that we can have for our residents, both year-round and seasonal. So it's bringing new resources for new problems, and seeing those new behaviors and figuring out what educational campaigns or what engagement strategies, any engagement strategy, would be effective to bringing in stakeholders who at that point had been very disengaged with the broader conversation of energy sustainability on the island. And I think that the researchers' mentality of, well, just tell them how much more it's going to cost their neighbor if they put up solar, and that will change their behavior, just didn't pan out. It's just not what we saw on Monhegan, at least. And I think what has worked better is talking about the long-term sustainability of the district, in particular when most of, if not all of the businesses except lobstering are run in the summer. If you're able to get business to business to understand the idea of financial sustainability, they kind of see each other as partners in getting there. And so it doesn't become a seasonal versus year-round issue. It becomes a business issue, and everybody's in the same boat. So let's do it. Let's lift the boat. So those are some of the strategies that have been tried and are being tried on Monhegan. I think the biggest discovery here, when it came to the energy efficiency efforts, was the question of when is too much energy, or when is too much efficiency, when is it just too much for an islanded grid? And that was basically what they were running into with the individual residential solar units. It wasn't just about some residences wanting to save more. It was also about recognizing the unsustainable financial rate structure of the district itself. And for them to come to terms that this wasn't just about incorporating renewable energy, it wasn't just about replacing generators, it was a longer term question of their financial structure. And And so that question kind of still stands out there. I think it could be that the answer is different for every community. When is energy efficiency too much? At every turn through that process of rate issues, solar exploration, and energy efficiency work, that those community actions that happen honestly all seem to be born out of crisis. And I think that that's something that we hear a lot in the literature and in various realms that we work. It's urgency that drives this. It's a crisis people are responding to. But I think what ultimately got us to a place of betterment, what got us to solutions, was actually the capacity building that occurred. That's what provided the momentum to progress those solutions. Because I think that the resiliency and the empowerment is in the people, not the project. And so the crisis was revenue and expenses not matching up. But the solution was actually building the capacity in the power district to do some long-term planning around wind versus solar. The capacity building that went into that work, that engaged the assessors and other community leaders, then led to the communication solutions that worked around energy efficiency and engaged the school. So the momentum forward to a more stable and certain energy future for Monhegan wasn't, the crises was the impetus, but it wasn't born out of the crises. It was born out of that capacity that was being built throughout the island. It ultimately is what overcame that leadership vacuum that I spoke about before. And it avoided the negative feedback loops that could have been created. And honestly, they were on a path of creating negative feedback loops where, well, I'll just put on solar on my residence and then I don't have to pay those electric rates. Solution solved. But that's a positive action with a negative consequence for the whole community. By focusing on the capacity building and the community engagement, they were able to avoid those types of feedbacks. In 2012, the district integrated solar power, as I've mentioned, and more recently, they've conducted a community process assessing the benefits and options of offshore wind power development. Another outsider perspective or observation of mine is that had Monhegan not gone through these massive crises and capacity building and community engagement processes from 2007 through 2012, I don't know that they would have had the leadership, the impetus, and honestly just the human capital to embark on a project as controversial as the offshore wind development and be able to do it in a way that is engaging a whole community around what are the benefits. Focus away from the project and focus toward the benefits, potential benefits, the focus toward the future as it could be and would be. That was no small feat in itself, and I think building the capacity and spanning the boundaries among the various community groups and the university and the private sector, and then all of the nonprofit and state agency partners through this process, it's really built relationships and trust. And that's where Suzanne McDonald got started on Monhegan. It was neighbor to neighbor. It was relationship building. It was just understanding the problem from somebody else's perspective and building up the trust with one another to solve small success, one obstacle, next obstacle. And that's basically become our approach to this collaborative work with community members and external partners as well. We all bring resources to bear, whether it's Island Institute, an external partner, or the community members involved. The community is who locally drives things. They drive what our role is at the Island Institute, and they drive how much of a role that we play. And so this is a double-edged sword for the Island Institute. Sometimes when we try to explain what we do or why we're in the room, it depends. And how many times do we use that phrase in this work, right? It just depends. And so I've seen that play out as well. But I think it's important that the communities get to own their problems and get to own their solutions, because Island Institute can walk away or lose funding and walk away. Academia can lose funding and walk away. state agencies can have different administrations or different foci, but the community will still be there. Do they have the capacity and the tools and the resources and the will to move on with the next problem or to continue on with their solution? They really need to own it and have that buy-in. Wherever you are in any of these stages, ongoing communication early and often about what is that role and expectation of one another is absolutely critical. And I think that Island Institute has, and myself and other roles as well, has had shortcomings and successes in that realm. And so I speak from both of those directions that it's really important. Be clear about the role that you have and the expectations that you have at every stage of the way. This idea of iterative communication, it's incorporated throughout the Island Institute's approach, which I mentioned we call a community development policy. So if you're interested in seeing it on paper, my card's in the back of the room, email me, I'll send it to you. It's pretty boring. And you all know it already anyway. But it's really important because, as I said, resiliency and empowerment are in the people, it's not in the project. So no matter what project you're working on right now, what project you end up working after this, just realize that it's the people and the relationships that need the focus. Still, the Island Institute recognizes this. We're still learning in this field. We have a lot to learn. We're still incorporating or implementing this policy. And so we may find new ways of doing it or new lessons to be learned. And so I guess I will end with a question for all of you is, what are you learning in your own sustainability science co-production framework? How are you applying it? What is working? What's not working? And what can we learn from one another as we're doing this in academia and with our communities at large? So I will take answers to that or answer your questions.
So we'll have some time for Q&A. It's always nice if the first question is from a student out there, or the first answer. Not to put any pressure. Of course. or just anybody. Questions or answers or comments?
One of the biggest questions that I get is who makes energy policy? And we have a little exercise that we do with folks, which is close your eyes and think in your head, who makes wind power energy policy? Who makes offshore wind power energy policy? And open your eyes and look at this picture, because this is who actually does it. Yeah?
It's not an answer, sorry. So you mentioned at the end there the sort of realization that whether the project pans out or not, right, one of the more important I think, products is the capacity in the community to work at the intersection of these really complex problems. And that resonates, I think, pretty deeply with some of my own work. But I wonder now that realization is struck, how do you navigate that sort of conversation with communities, especially in early stages where they are very interested in the thing happening, not necessarily a sort of more nebulous capacity that comes out of it?
Yeah, it's yeah, I think there's a theory around this in anthropology that I would butcher if I tried to recall. But yeah, it's kind of like what is the objectives or hopeful endpoints from a researcher's perspective versus from a community member's perspective. And there continues to be a dichotomy, no matter how long you've partnered or how much trust you have built up in each other, you ultimately know that that community member is going to have to live with that decision. And the researcher isn't. And the partner isn't. And they do get to work, move on in their professional lives and maybe not be a part of that community. So I think that's where the communication becomes critical to say, this is my expectation and this is my role and this is why I'm here. And to be transparent about that helps build that trust. Ultimately, I don't start with that conversation because I don't know that it's helpful to engaging a community member if I come in saying, I'm going to help you build your capacity. That might be taken a little offensively. And I think, this type of conversation, or the way that I've been talking about it today, has been very much because you're an audience of academics and you work with stakeholders. You're not a stakeholder who is trying to engage an expert, and that's just a different perspective, so you're going to use different language, but it's a very good observation. I came to the Island Institute not knowing what the word broadband meant, but I got the job because I had been working with municipalities to get them to do things they did not want to do. And I think that is the way that I approach these projects, is trying to come in with the information and the answers that are helpful to engaging a community member in that issue. So yes, their first question is, well, how much internet speed do I really need? Their first question is, what is a reasonable kilowatt price? Or how in the heck would we get wind power or solar out here? Isle of Ho is still working on getting their solar project up and running, for instance. And even more tricky than that are climate change issues. The Island Institute, after several iterative conversations with stakeholders, mostly partners, came up with the team name of Sea Level Rise Resiliency. And when I started on that team, I'm like, I'm going to go to these communities and they're going to look at me like an alien, like sea level rise, like what? And that's exactly what happened. So the first 10 minutes were super awkward in trying to navigate a conversation that, a town official, regardless of the hat they wore, just didn't own. They didn't own climate resiliency. They didn't own sea level rise or flooding. And they'd often point to somebody else, like the road commissioner, for instance. So how do you engage these community members when your objective ultimately is to build capacity and their objective is to implement a project, is to talk around it and to be communicative? So 40 minutes into a conversation with a town manager about sea level rise, all of a sudden he's admitting that their permitting requires people to elevate their new structures and piers by 2.5 feet instead of just 1. So they're doing it, they just don't call it that. And so it's finding where are those gaps in communication and language. How can we speak each other's language so that we're talking about the same thing, and so that I can help get you to your goal of sea level rise resiliency, and you're ultimately building local capacity for the next crisis, whether it's housing or opioids or whatever it is. So does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Because I kind of talked around that answer as well.
You embodied the answer.
Thank you. Yes.
I've got somewhat of an answer to your question. I worked as an undergrad last semester on a team with the Orono Town Council to help them wrap the plans around implementing a municipal solar project, which I have to say I have no idea where it stands now, but we presented to some council members about how other municipalities in Maine are doing it and implementing to get all the street lights and town buildings and whatnot on solar power. And very similar to the project, except that it's a larger municipality and it's not such a community. And on a community like Monhegan, it's much easier to get everybody together. It's an island. And it's similar in that it seems like the biggest hurdle and the biggest help that we could provide was just raising awareness and understanding. And you sort of talked all about this in your presentation, and in that answer you gave a great having to talk around things and realize that we're all on the same page actually. And then you gave an example of getting people on the insulation project. How did you get people on board with that? Well, it was student-led. They gave, my understanding is that sort of students led these demonstrations and taught the community how to implement the insulation in their homes. So how does this apply to to the larger municipalities, because those are the huge issues. We should really insulate our homes better just economically, but also it seems we should really transition towards renewable energy as our source of power. So how do you see this scaling up?
It's a great question. This scaling up community development strategies from a very rural, remote, sparsely populated and low populated area up to a very dense population, very large population, a much more complex city kind of government. We work in Portland as well. We work coast-wide. And so I think at that point, you actually look for the niches and you look for the opportunity windows, as they're called in policy, for where can you put leverage, where can you find that one nugget that's needed to move a body of work forward. So, for instance, Rockland is doing a fantastic job in starting to establish its energy action committee and office, and is hiring a sustainability person, FYI, for anybody graduating. And for them, basically looking at what do we do first, and where are our strengths, and what can we build on for small successes toward the bigger aspirations. That's also an example of how a Climate to Thrive on MDI has been operating, basically dividing itself up as volunteers into subcommittees of interest. So some are working on energy efficiency, others are working on solar, some are working on business sustainability, waste stream issues, and basically how do they work within their own social circles of their community to move all of those projects forward. So in a sense, the work is not easier because you have a larger population. You're just doing it in smaller focus areas and more of them, so that you can move the body of work forward in an efficient manner. So that at least that's one strategy, is basically divide and conquer, because you have the population. That doesn't work everywhere. Many islands wish they had the population of Vinyl Haven, about 1,500 year-round. Vinyl Haven has several committees to work on community issues. If you look across those committees, they're the same community members, wearing different hats, coming to a meeting on a different day. It's the same people showing up again and again. It's not proportional to their population. And I think in those places, it comes back to that communication and education. So for broadband, for instance, we weren't going to get the town to set up another committee where they already have half a dozen that are already understaffed because the volunteers are doing all of those committees. Instead, it was reaching out to the local chamber, reaching out to the local businesses that were desperate to be able to run a credit card machine and allow their customers to have Wi-Fi at the same time. God forbid in the 21st century. So it was engaging them and having fiber talks, as they like to call them, to talk about the importance of the issue and just bring awareness to how it interconnected with so many of their other issues. That's what got the attention of the select board members and said, we need a broadband committee, because we're not going to solve our diverse economies issues. Basically, there's the lobster co-op is the only place you can work, maybe the ferry service, maybe the medical facility. So how do we diversify our economies? We get broadband so that people can work from home, they can telecommute, they can start a business remotely. So it just became a tool, not a sufficient tool, but an absolutely essential tool to solving a lot of their other economic and social issues. And so education and communication, defining that community need in the terms of the community, was really important. Yes?
So we're lucky, most of the people here are students. They might want to be you someday. If you got to be Stephenie, and if you wanted to be her, what's one thing that you feel like you want to know, you want to learn to do that you maybe don't feel like you could do now? So what are your thoughts? What would you, talking to strangers, putting together all this information? So give us some examples of what you'd like to learn, so you can be her. Oh, you already know everything, that's great.
Yeah.
So I love talking to strangers for the most part, so that's part of pretty much covered. I bartend for my forte. But I suppose tailoring not just conversations that can kind of flow and you can get a feel for things, but like disseminating information and tailoring that specifically to the community. How did you develop that skill set, and what helped you along there?
That's a really good question. I failed. Actually, I probably shouldn't tell you this because it'll jump back up into the Google account, but go ahead and Google my name in the town of Lee, Maine. I failed big time. I came up there and I told them, look, if you don't want shoreline zoning, we're going to do it for you. Like that, those are your options. You do it, you do planning and zoning on your own, or the state will do it for you. Boy, did that fail bad. I think, basically having the humility to say, okay, why did that fail? And not just putting my head in the sand. It's not real practical or technical to tell you how to solve that, but it's very much just coming to terms with who you are and how you're willing to work with people and being reflective and making the space for that reflection. That's probably something I continue to struggle with today, is like just secure a few hours a week for yourself to say, what's gone well and why? What have I enjoyed and why? How can I do more of that? I think that really helps me identify opportunities that I otherwise wouldn't be paying attention to. And so for the shoreline zoning thing, it was just talking to the code enforcement officer and said, like, how did I botch that so bad? We've been to 3 other of your towns and it went great. Like, how'd you set me up for that? And he really did. I mean, the press was there. This is why this is like iconic on Google. And he's like, yeah, they don't think that the state doing it for them is something that they can ignore. They can just be in denial that they have zoning at all. If they don't do it, they don't care if the state does it or not, because they'll just ignore it. And so the message changed in the next town I went into. I said, look, this is a mandate, so you can either do the planning, think about how shoreline zoning can benefit your community and how you can adapt it and tweak it and model it for your community, or the state will do it for you and it's very cookie cutter and it stinks and it won't work for you and it'll make your situation worse. And so I think it was just about learning to tailor information for the audience. Was about how do I frame it as an opportunity instead of a problem. So the problem wasn't that the state was going to mandate shoreline zoning. The problem wasn't that the community wasn't doing planning on its own. The problem was that the community was missing an opportunity. And how could I help them leverage that opportunity, maximize that opportunity, and get something out of it? And really get something for nothing, because they didn't pay me to do it. So in fact, it was a win-win if they wanted to do the planning and the thought of how to model shoreline zoning for their own community instead of just adopting a statewide model.
Now, doesn't that really make you want to be her? Out of time.
Yes, we have, but definitely reach out.
A little bit of time so you can go up and tell her you want to be her.
I'm going to turn the question around.